Alright, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about two-dimensional design principles. We've looked at balance and composition, and today we're going to talk about focal points and emphasis and what these are and how to go about creating focal points. So first, what are focal points then? Focal points are essentially the areas in an image, in a two-dimensional image, that you want the audience or the viewer to focus on. And a better understanding of how to go about doing this, I think, creates stronger work, more interesting and engaging work. If we can operate and basically control how we want the viewers to move through a piece, right? How we want to take their attention through an image, this will create for stronger artworks. And not only that, it helps you better understand the artworks that you're looking at. Focal points are created through many different techniques, and here we're going to talk about the 5 main techniques of creating focal points, which are contrast, isolation, placement, convergence, and the unusual. And then a 6th would be no focal points, right? And there's often many images that are created with the intent to not have a focal point. First, contrast, right? So in this image here of this still life painting, the lobster here is clearly the focal point, and it's operating on many different levels of emphasis, but the main here being contrast, right? This lobster is this bright red up against the dark greens and browns and blacks, and it pops out, it sticks out. So very easily we can see how contrast works in this image. Here we have Jesus being mocked by the soldiers by Manet, and the skin tone of Jesus here is obviously contrasted against the black of the background, as well as the clothing on the soldiers. We have a couple of other things operating here, and the placement of him is centralized. We have some convergence of direct lines and implied lines, but again, the contrast being the one emphasis that I'm trying to highlight here, we can see. Isolation is another way to create a focal point. This can be done by taking an object or a subject and removing them from the group, putting them by themselves. But isolation can also just be a single object or entity or figure. And here in this image, we have the woman as the focal point. Again, a couple other things are working here. There's placement of her and maybe some rule of thirds. She seems to be in that lower left-hand intersection if we put that grid on top. But then a secondary focal point here would be the house on the right in the background. We can see that's where her gaze is looking, the implied line of the direction of where she's facing. So that could be a secondary focal point. But isolation being that she is the isolated subject in this image. A group of children and one person off in the distance, that person becomes the focal point. And again, many times these focal points are clear and obvious, and sometimes they work more subconsciously and more indirectly. Our eyes tend to flick around these two-dimensional images without us really directing them or trying to look at certain things. We can see how focal areas just kind of pop into the image and force us to pay attention. So contrast, isolation, and now placement. The center of images seems to work as a natural focal area, right? The centers of compositions, our eyes will gradually or eventually kind of make our way there and come to rest in the center of these images. Here we have another painting of Jesus in the center, and we can see the white robe is a contrast to the muted tones of the followers around him. But again, I'm isolating placement here as the compositional tool to create focal point, right? If we think back to balance, right, radial balance, most often in any image that's a radially balanced image, the center will always be the focal point. Now, convergence is probably the most interesting and the most complex way to go about creating focal points. And these can be through direct lines or implied lines. Now here we have a woman on a bicycle in the background there, and we can see these lines on the sides are all pointing her direction. She's also highlighted by the contrast of the black background, placement as well. She's not direct center, but she's centered enough in this one-point perspective image. We can see how complex and interesting this can get here. So some architectural images here that show convergence of these perspective lines to create focal areas. Here's another one. We have all these converging lines, a one-point perspective photograph. The chain in the foreground could be considered to be a focal area too, and that's another technique when we talk about foreground, middle ground, and background. Just to highlight the example here, convergence, these are the lines that are all converging into what could be a focal area. Here we see the envelope being this focal area through convergence. We can see the fingers, her gaze looking down, the lines on the table from the paper, all are converging on this envelope. Here we can see the convergence of the railroad tracks and the grass and the shoreline all converging onto the man's head there. But how else is he the focal point, right? We can think about contrast as well, right? The color of his clothing is quite different. He's isolated from the group as well. The placement of him is not center, but it's centered enough as to where it would get our attention. If we think about the rule of thirds and how the grid would overlay here, we could also see that he would be on that vertical axis on the right. The fifth one here is the unusual, so creating a focal point by the unusual, right? Something that sticks out from the group here. And by default, the object or subject will stand out and demand attention just through the differences in the image. And then lastly, we could have no focal point. And there's many reasons why we would not want to have a focal point. If you think about decorative patterning or design, right? Wallpapers or things that are not meant to be engaged through a narrative. Again, patterning. Many artists here, as Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, these compositions are created without a focal point in mind. Some paintings here that don't necessarily seem to have focal areas. So let's go through some of these and just break down the things that we've looked at as far as balance, composition, and focal points and emphasis, right? So what could we say is the focal point here? So the man is the focal point, but how is this operating? What is working to make this the focal point? So the contrast of his jacket against the ground, so that's one way. The diagonals seem to converge, right? Not directly on him, but they're in a place that creates an X, and he's the closest thing to that, so that could be another way we could consider this to be a focal point. Isolation, he is the only subject in the composition. And if we think about the rule of thirds, now the train tracks themselves aren't adhering to the rule of thirds. They're going, the bottom left corner to the top right is creating a strong diagonal. But if you were to place the rule of thirds grid on top, we can see that the male is placed right in that bottom right-hand quadrant. And if we think about balance, is this image balanced or not? Well, it's asymmetrical, but it's not balanced. Remember, an image doesn't have to be balanced to be a successful composition, but this is just so we understand the language and the terminology, right? So it's an asymmetrical composition, but we wouldn't say asymmetrically balanced. So a lot of different things working here. Let's take a moment to see what's happening here. So what would be the focal point or focal points, right? Remember, many of these compositions can have multiple focal points. So I would say the first focal point is the girl's face, right? And we'll go into why that is and what's happening there. But as a secondary, we could say the old man's face, right? The two are locked into this gaze, right? Creating an implied line between the two. And there's other elements that are pointing to these focal areas. So if we look at her hand, her left hand is pointing at his face. Right? We look at the position of her body. We can see that her leg is kind of creating another implied line up to her. The man is working down on this piece of wood, right? We can see his arm is going down into that awl or that tool. You can see his right arm is all focusing down as well. The tool itself, right? We have that object on the ground that's laying horizontally. That's also pointing to this. We can see the shadows underneath the man are also pointing here, those two there. So we could say this would be perhaps a third focal area. So our eye is first attracted to the gaze, right, between the two, where our gaze is hitting her face and then moving to the man's head and then moving down, right? We have this triangular movement throughout the composition that we're looking through. Convergence, I would say, being the primary method of emphasis that's happening here. Contrast as well. The girl's face is highly lit, right, against the background. This technique that we're seeing here, this chiaroscuro technique, is this thematic stage lighting. So there's quite a bit of contrast. If we think about balance, how this image could be balanced, it's asymmetrical, but I would say it is balanced. It seems to have the same visual weight both on the left and the right. How about this one? So the focal point here would be, I would say, the crib first, but then there's some other things happening. We also have this window, and we have this reflection of the crib on the floor. How is the focal area here? So we have contrast, the white of the crib up against the browns and the blacks. Isolation also, it's the only thing in the frame, in the composition. The placement has it somewhat centralized, but that works as a way to create an emphasis. We imagine the rule of thirds, but flipped for a portrait, right? We can see that crib is in one of those locations, in one of those intersections that work. If we think about balance, how this image is balanced, it's asymmetrical, but not balanced. And the reason, I'm going through each of these images and we're kind of breaking these things down just because I want you to gain a better understanding of how these things work. So when you're looking at your own images now moving forward, I'd like you to just think about these things and how some of these are operating, where the focal points are, how the composition is structured, because you will be tasked with demonstrating some of these compositional elements with your own photographs in our first exercise. So let's take a look here. Lots of things happening. Where is the primary focal point? I would say it's the man's face. Right? So we can see it. He's looking towards us, not at us, but we can see his face. Secondary would be the woman's face. And they have this implied gaze between them that our eyes can navigate back and forth through. Lots of convergence happening here. We have elements in the foreground that are creating strong linear elements. Right? We have elements in the background behind the man coming down into his head. Right? The woman's cane is angled up towards her head. We have elements in the background on that wall that are creating directional lines as well. The man's arm creating another implied line to his head. Again, parts of the wall. What other tools are being used here? Well, I would say contrast. Contrast of the man's shirt and just the high value range in the image itself is striking. We have really light lights and dark darks, but the contrast here of the man's white shirt and the woman's dark jacket. Placement, we don't have a centralized image, but we have these two figures that are basically commanding the center of this image. And like I said, convergence, lots of converging lines that are happening. There's a really strong diagonal that's moving from that light source on the left. So I wouldn't say the image adheres to rule of thirds, but there is a strong diagonal to create movement through the piece. Balance. How is this image balanced? Seems to be asymmetrically balanced, as in the visual weight seems the same on both the left and the right. Where would the focal point of this image be? Well, I would say it's the woman in red on the left, but a secondary focal point would be this vehicle, the car. Now, the reason I say the left area, the woman in red, is because that does seem to draw more attention, right? Not only through the contrast, the red up against the background, but there's lots of converging lines that are moving in her direction, right? We can see these flagpoles up above are moving this way, and those are being reflected underneath her. But the car does have some convergence, right? We have that strong diagonal from the left. We have the reflection underneath, the buildings on top. Just to the right of the car, we have some perspective lines that are above and below. So the car becomes this focal point as well, too. Oh, I skipped ahead a little bit there, but if we talk about balance, the image to me seems balanced, but asymmetrically so. Again, the contrast of her dress. Isolation as well. She becomes a focal point because she is the only human in the frame, but again, the car is also by itself as well. So you could make the argument for both of these focal points quite well. And the convergence, and another strong diagonal here. Not that I don't see this image operating with the rule of thirds, but I do see a strong diagonal both on the left and the right. And again, asymmetrically balanced. So just to recap here, artists employ emphasis in order to draw our attention to a specific area in the work. We call this area the focal point. Emphasis is the method or methods used to create this focal point. And in this last image here, we have lots of different things working, right? We have placement, we have isolation, we have contrast, we have rule of thirds if we think about the upper right intersection. We have, what else? Diagonals working. So that's emphasis and focal point. We'll continue with rhythm and repetition and size and proportions here.